Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our online discussion on youth employment and gender equality, organized by the Hellenic Foundation for European and Foreign Policy, ELIAMEP. Today's discussion is the final event for the research project on youth employment and gender equality, mobilizing human capital for sustainable growth in Greece, which was funded by the EEA grants and implemented by ELIAMEP in collaboration with the Norwegian Institute for Labour and Social Research, Fafo. So during our discussion, we will be analyzing the research report on youth inclusion and gender equality in Greek labour market, trends, challenges, and lessons from the Nordic countries that was published recently. We have a rather long list of speakers who I'm sure will keep within the time allocated, and we have 4 discussants also, and then we will have an open discussion in which the speakers will be given the chance to get back to the questions raised by the discussants, but also by the audience. So please do text your questions, and we will collect them and put them through to the speakers. Let us start straight away. I will give the floor to Frode Overland Andersen, the ambassador of Norway to Greece. The floor is yours, Ambassador.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the kind introduction. On behalf of the donors of the EEA grants, Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein, it's a pleasure for me to be here and offer a very few introductory comments, of course, because we all want to get to the substance. You introduced the project, and I think it's a very good project and the cooperation between ELIAMEP and Fafo, as you mentioned. And I think a special thank you today goes to the research teams, both from the Norwegian side and the Greek side. And I think, you know, the topic of the introductions couldn't be more timely given the situation in the Greek labor market, and indeed most European labor markets at the moment, because when I go around Greece and meet especially young people, they feel left out of the labor market to a large extent, and the corona situation has only aggravated this dual layer in the labor market, where you have the have and the have-nots, the ones who are inside the formalized proper labor market and the ones who are outside in the gray or even black labor market. And I think these are important topics to be addressed by researchers, because they will then give us knowledge to do proper policies for rectifying some of these wrongs. The same goes for gender issues, which is of course a long-standing challenge for many labor markets, and I think the Nordic labor markets could offer some important lessons that could be translated into policies. I will not go a lot on about this, but I think, you know, this just underlines both the timeliness and the importance of the research being presented today. I would like to conclude by thanking both research teams for their hard work and also for their coming presentations today. And I'm looking forward to following the discussion. So on behalf of the donors, thank you so much for a job well done. And I'm looking very much to see the results coming up soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Now I will give the floor to the first speaker. 2 speakers, actually. I understand it will be a joint presentation by Ragnhild Steen Jensen and Hege Strand. The floor is yours. They are both researchers at Fafo.
Thank you very much. Hege Strand, and I will give a short presentation of our contribution in the final report. In the report, we present an overview of the labor market and situation in the Scandinavian countries. Furthermore, we describe policies implemented to improve the access of young people and women to the labor market. And I will start to talk about gender equality in the labor market, and then Hege will talk about the young people's situation. First, we look at the overall employment rate. The figure shows that Sweden has one of the highest employment rates in Europe, measured at 82% in 2019. Norway had an employment rate at 80% and Denmark at 78%. All countries well above the EU 28 average at 74%. At the lower, if you go back on Hege, you were a bit, at the lower end is Greece, the green line, with an employment rate at 61% in 2019, and probably illustrating that the Greek labor market has not recovered fully after the financial crisis. Now you can turn. An important reason for the high employment levels in Scandinavia is high female labor market participation. These figures show the gender gap in employment, and we see that Sweden has the lowest gender gap. Norway has a gender gap around 5% and Denmark slightly higher, while in Greece the gender gap in employment is close to 20%, well above the EU average. This means that the labor market participation among women is on par with men in Norway. And it is important to stress that Norwegian women do not constitute a marginal or vulnerable group in the labor market. However, there are some important differences in men's and women's labor market affiliation, and we do not have full gender equality in the labor market. Next. First, part-time work is much more pronounced among women than men. And part-time employment is much more prevalent in Scandinavian countries than in the EU at large. As we can see from this figure, part-time work is more widespread among women in Norway and Denmark than in Sweden. The main reason for the part-time work is that women still combine work with family obligations to a larger degree than men. We also see that part-time work is much more common in the youngest segment of the population. We also, however, this is most likely linked to another phenomenon, namely that young people combine education and employment. Second, the gender-segregated labor market is constituted of two dimensions, a horizontal and a vertical segregation. The Norwegian labor market is strongly gender segregated. Most women work in female-dominated industries like care work, health, and education, while men dominate in technical professions and crafts. Also, women work in the public sector. 70% of public sector employees are women. In the private sector, it's different. Over 60% of the employees are men, and only 2 out of 10 men work in the public sector. And there is a vertical segregation, with more men working in chief positions, particularly in the private sector. This gender-segregated labor market and the part-time work among women are the main explanations for the persistent wage gap between Norwegian women and men.
Okay. I now shift to talk about the labor market integration of young people in Norway. Labor market participation rates are high among young adults. Here, men are marked out in blue, I think, and women are the red line. This indicates that about 80% of young in their late 20s have some form, either part-time or full-time, attachment to the labor market in Norway. And behind this high share of labor market participation is also a highly educated workforce of young people. Education rates have been on the increase for several decades, and the current young generation is going to be the most highly educated in Norwegian history or Scandinavian history. Around half of all young people in Norway hold a university degree at a higher or a lower level. However, more worryingly, also in Norway, still almost 20% of young adults have only completed compulsory schooling or have started but not completed upper secondary education. young people with low education constitutes one of the most vulnerable groups in the Norwegian labour market. This is also reflected in the NEET rates of Norway. They primarily consist of young people with low education. In Norway, about 6% of young people fall into the NEET category, and this is based on measurements from the Labour Force survey. Based on measurements from register data and not survey data, the number of NEETs is higher, measured at about 11%. And it has also increased during the COVID-19 pandemic. In this graph, I marked out two different groups of NEETs. The orange bar is the unemployed NEETs. These are actively seeking work and are registered at the employment service offices. The other NEET group are the inactive group of NEETs who are not currently seeking work. This passive NEET group is actually quite large in Norway within the NEET category, which is a problem for the Nordic model, as these young people are not registered at the public employment centres and therefore escapes being targeted by activation measures. A key strategy to secure high employment rates is for the welfare state to rely on so-called active labour market policies or activation policies. The objective of these measures is to increase employment among people taking part in job programs. Over the past decade, active labour market policies have shifted toward what has been labelled activation policies. One change that has become more prominent in activation policies is that they now rely more heavily on conditionality. That is an explicit link between receiving cash benefits and participating in activation measures. This is a more punitive strategy, binding participants to job programs or otherwise risk being sanctioned and to lose their benefit payouts. Furthermore, activation policies are also now directed at an ever-widening target group. This includes disabled, social assistance recipients, immigrants, the low-educated, and not the least, young people. In Norway, young people registering at unemployed offices are a prioritized group for participation in activation measures. There are some theories also thinking that perhaps people, or young people in particular, feel intimidated by these job programs and therefore leave or fail to register as unemployed, which is actually a problem for the activation of young in Norway. So, despite having activation policies, Norway, as well as the other Scandinavian countries, continue to struggle with rather stable and more lately during the pandemic, even increasing NEET rates among the young. Few job opportunities for the low-educated and highly efficient demands in the high efficiency demands in the Norwegian labour market are significant barriers for young with little education. Therefore, active labour market policies targeting young people continues to be a very central part of Norwegian employment policies. Thank you.
Thank you, Hege. So is Ragnhild coming in now?
Ragnhild and I are both here.
I have spoken. I'm finished.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you. So we are moving to the next presentation, which is by Dimitris Katsikas, who was the coordinator, among the coordinators of the project. So I will allow him a few more minutes, but always within the time available. Dimitris, over to you.
Thank you, Manos. Let me just see my presentation. So thank you very much, Manos. Yes, I would like to start before I present the findings of of our research. I would like to thank also His Excellency the Norwegian Ambassador for the support and the guidance of the embassy staff throughout the implementation of this project. It was really very useful. And thanks, of course, to everybody that has come and joined us to hear the results of our research. So, as it was said before, as you, Manos, said, and the ambassador as well mentioned, the study presented today, actually, it was published online yesterday. It's freely available on the ELIAMEP's website since yesterday, and it's going to be soon on Fafo's website, I'm sure. It was the result of a project, as you mentioned, called Youth Employment and Gender Equality, Mobilizing Human Capital for Sustainable Growth in Greece. It started last year in October and ended this year in October and was supported by the A grants. And the inspiration behind this project was the recognition that two large groups of the Greek population, women and young men, are underemployed in all senses of this word in the Greek labor market, with adverse consequences both for the Greek economy, but also for the economic and life prospects of both women and young people. Along these lines, we designed a project, we proposed to do a project with two major objectives. The first objective was to document and analyze the status of young people in the Greek labor markets, putting an emphasis on barriers to access and professional advancement and problems related to gender. I have to say that the idea here was to go more wide rather than deep in the sense of mapping all the issues that relate to youth's integration in the labor market, or the problems and barriers they face. And I should say that what we're presenting today in this project is the first stage of the proposed project. There's a second stage where hopefully it will happen in the future, where we will delve deeper into the research findings that came out from this first research and formulate concrete policy proposals. The second objective of the project was to provide, taking advantage of Fafo's expertise in Scandinavian labor markets, provide an overview of youth employment and gender equality in Scandinavia, as these countries have largely resolved the issue that we are dealing with in this study, the underutilization of human capital, particularly the young and women. I would also like to say that although there was a great team of researchers involved in the project, although Daphne and I will be presenting on behalf of the ELIAMEP's team, I would like to just mention the names of the other researchers: Haralambos Somalidis, Apostolos Vasianos, Kyriakos Filinis, Beryl Lalioti, and George Paoulatos were involved in the project on ELIAMEP's side. And also, I would like to mention Tune Floten, who is director of Fafo, who was also closely involved with the project. Unfortunately, she was not able to be here today. From my understanding is that she's a member of a high-level committee in Norway dealing with the pandemic, and therefore, as you can understand, she has very limited free time. But I would like to thank her personally and the other researchers from Fafo, and Fafo more generally, for I think a very harmonious and productive collaboration during this project, and I'm looking forward to cooperating again in the next stage of the project when it happens. Now, moving to the study itself, here you see this is the study, the cover of the study uploaded yesterday, and according to the objectives I just outlined, the study is structured around 4 parts. The first presents the state of play regarding youth's presence in the Greek labor market. The second focuses on the Greek educational system and its link to the labor market. In the third part, we present a youth labor market survey that was conducted during the program. And the fourth part presents the performance and policies in Scandinavian countries regarding youth and women's inclusion into the labor market. Now, turning to the actual study, I will just give you the big picture, focusing on very few points, major points. So first, in our research, there emerged a number of structural trends that have shaped the integration of youth in the Greek labor market over the past 20 years. The first trend was a dramatic increase in the number of young people in the Greek labor force. This is mainly due to adverse demographics and the migration wave during the crisis in the 2010s. This reflects a broader decline of young population in Greece taking place over these 2 decades. And it is worth noting that, for example, labor market participants in the age 15 to 34 in 2001 were a bit more than 1.9 million. And in 2019, they were down to less than 1.3 million. So a really significant decrease there. A second major trend is the longer stay in education of young people. So there are fewer, but they are more educated compared to past generations. It is indicative that in 2019, the enrollment rates in higher education in Greece were 44%. This is the highest rate in the entire European Union. Of course, not all of them graduate, but this is another issue on which we can talk about perhaps later. And another thing we saw was also that the value that the labor market attributes to education changed over the crisis in the past decade, in the sense that better educated youth were more protected against unemployment, also enjoyed better employment rates compared to less well-educated youth, and that was not the case always before the crisis. A third trend is the increased share of young women in the labor force over the past 20 years. Before the crisis, this was done in a positive manner, if you like. So in the sense that an increased number of young women entered the labor force. After the crisis, this was accelerated, but actually was driven by a negative, if you like, development in the sense that men were more impacted by the crisis, as some male-dominated sectors, like, for example, construction, were particularly hard hit by the crisis. On the other hand, we think that this trend may continue in the future, although there's uncertainty, of course, because of 2 factors. One is the second trend we mentioned above, education. Young women are the better educated part of the Greek population. They account for over 60% of recent post-secondary vocational graduates and higher education graduates. And also the increased incidence of part-time employment after the crisis may also lead to increased women participation because women tend to work more in part-time employment. Now, as I said, a principal objective was to find the barriers, the obstacles, the problems that young men face when trying to enter the labor market. And one major problem that we saw from our research is, of course, the state of the economy, which is also acknowledged by the respondents in the survey themselves as a major factor. Of course, we all know, and this means particularly the impact of the crisis the previous decade. We all know that the crisis had a huge impact on the economy and the labor market. This impact was even bigger for the young people, and we see a general pattern when labor market indicators deteriorated between 2009 and 2015. There has been a gradual recovery since 2014, but it's still, all these indicators are well below pre-crisis levels. So just for example, here we see that in 2019, just before the pandemic broke out, the employment rate for people aged 15 to 34 was 10 percentage points lower than that in 2008, and unemployment rate was almost double that of 2008. Here I have only one graph because I want to give you the big picture, not to burden you with a lot of details. There are many graphs in the report for those that want to check them out. This is a cross-tabulation of 2 actually questions in our survey. How long did it take you to find a job related to the career you'd like to pursue, not just any job? And in which year did you find this job? And you see that the difference that the crisis made. You see at the right-hand side, the percentage of people that were able to find such a job in less than a year. The percentage goes down even after 2015, when gradual recovery after 2016, after the economy started recovering. And you see the deep blue bar, people reporting more than 2 years. It went from 8% before 2009, 28% after 2015. Also here, it is not shown, but more than 1 in 5, close to 1 in 4 actually responded, say that they have not been able to find such a job at all. A final note, brief note on the economic conditions. We did, because between the proposal and the implementation of the project, the pandemic occurred. So we thought we should have a brief chapter on the pandemic, and the results are that the pandemic has not impacted in a substantial way the labor market, at least those that were employed already before the pandemic occurred. Of course, young people who wanted to get into the labor market were deeply affected because in such conditions in conditions of lockdown, for example, they were not able to find any new jobs. So in a sense, the bet now is during the recovery to try to integrate these people and not turn them also into long-term unemployed. A second major obstacle is the mismatch between youth educational qualifications and the skills of those required by the economy. Here, there are two factors that we can speak about. The first, the inability of the Greek economy, the apparent inability of the Greek economy to absorb more highly qualified young people. Almost 1 in 3 young people aged 15 to 34 work in retail, trade, and food and beverage service activities, and occupations as sales workers or professional sales workers, which are typical of these sectors. I would like to say that the concentration of employment in these sectors increased during the crisis, even further. And also, I would like to say that it's not shown in our the final draft of the report, but it was done in our analysis. It was shown in our analysis that these sectors are the top sectors for all age subgroups. So not only for the very young 15 to 24, but also for 25 to 34-year-olds. These are the top sectors in terms of employment and the top occupations. On the other hand, employment in high technology manufacturing and knowledge-intensive high technology services is somewhere between 2 and 3%, which places Greece 25th in the European Union. And as a result, you have two, if you like, opposing trends. On the one hand, young people getting more and more educated, and on the other hand, being concentrated in their employment in sectors and occupations of low or middle skills. And as a result, we have had during the past decade a substantial increase in the rates of overqualification. A second problem relates to the failure to connect the educational system to the economy. So we see in the study that research, for example, is concentrated in universities with little connection to productive processes. The Greek business sector ranks 24th in the EU as an employer of researchers. On the side of teaching, there's a poor design of study programs in both vet and higher education, a very poor link to the market. We see, surprisingly, in our survey, we saw vet graduates saying that they have reporting higher incidence of horizontal mismatch than higher education graduates, which shows that even vet programs are not very well designed. And we see that fields of study with low professional prospects, for example, humanities, social science, education, continue to be very popular despite the fact that people graduating from these scientific fields have problems finding a job in the Greek labor market. As a result, we have high incidence of horizontal mismatch. And there is a question that occurs that we have more graduates, but what kind of graduates exactly do we have? What qualifications do they have, and how are these are related to the needs of the Greek economy? More generally, it emerges that there's generally lack of support for the transition from education to work. So, for example, a counseling system for students for their educational and career options, the job seeking mechanism, support for that, the vet system, active labor market policies that Norwegian researchers mentioned in Scandinavia. These are all either lacking completely or are incomplete and not well connected together. Now, the poor integration of young people in the Greek labor market affects diversely their life prospects. In our survey, we find very high levels of financial dependency. Over 50% of respondents aged 25 to 29 and close to 40% of those aged 30 to 34 say that they are financially supported by their families still. And 1 out of 3 of them, of respondents, are thinking of leaving the country, particularly those below the age of 30. And also this situation undermines, of course, trust in public institutions. So 1 out of 3 only respondents in our survey say that they believe that the educational system is doing a good job preparing them for the labor market. And less than 1 in 3 in them, and this is irrespective of gender, age subgroup, or sector of occupation, says that they trust the trade unions. And of course, this is a problem going forward to find a solution to this situation. Although we're not meant to provide policy proposals at this stage of the project, I think we can say a couple of words here and finish with that. I think particularly through the comparison with the Scandinavian labor markets, we see the need for a more holistic approach to youth employment. And this is both at the level of guiding principles. For example, in Scandinavia, they have this active society doctrine where effectively they say that, you need to put people at work, and this is good for the economy, for society, but for their own self-fulfillment and life prospects. So there's this goal of full employment, and then build a comprehensive system of education to work transition, which includes all these parts that I mentioned before, which in Greece are lacking or are underdeveloped. We have seen, the truth is that in recent years, we have seen a lot of efforts and reforms, and some of them, or many of them, in the right direction. But you get the feeling that they're unconnected and do not constitute a whole that could work effectively. And of course, whatever happens in that part of the equation, if the Greek growth model is not transformed, the way the Greek economy operates does not change, and therefore Greek businesses are not able to absorb higher qualified and use effectively higher qualified personnel, then this is for naught. I know this is a cliche, they need to transform the Greek growth model, but it is also very, very true. So I will stop here and will be happy to discuss more details with you later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Dimitri. That was very useful. Dimitris, of course, apart from being a senior researcher at ELIAMEP, is also an assistant professor at the University of Athens. And he used to be, until very recently, the head of the Greek and European Economy Observatory at ELIAMEP. And now I will give the floor to the next speaker, who's Daphne Nicolitsas. Daphne was obviously involved in this project. She's an associate of ELIAMEP and an assistant professor at the University of Crete. Daphne, over to you.
Okay, so thank you very much. Let me try and get this into full screen. So thank you very much to Manos for giving me the floor. Thank you very much to the team for trusting me to present part of the work. So as Dimitris already stressed, this is joint work with all these people mentioned on the slide, Haralambos Christomalidis, Apostolos Kasianos, Kyriakos Pilinis, Dimitris Katsikas, Seberi Lagiotti, and myself. Dimitris focused on the age aspect of the report. I will be focusing on in a full screen participation. So I now be focusing on the gender dimension of the report. Is the presentation not visible? So over the last 4 decades or so, the participation rate of women in the Greek labor market has more than doubled. From around 30% in the 1980s, the participation rate of women reached around 60% in 2019. Despite these improvements, the participation rate of women in Greece lies behind that of men and lies behind that of women in other advanced OECD countries. The focus of the report is on young age groups, defined in the report as those between 15 and 34. And although a gap between men and women in Greece and women in other advanced OECD countries exists, it is higher in other age groups than those between 15 to 34. So let me sort of present some of the facts. On the right-hand side, you can see prime age individuals between 35 to 59. On the left-hand side, young individuals between 20 to 34. You can see that the gap between men and women is higher.
Excuse me, Daphne, but we cannot see your, we can only see the first slide of your presentation.
So let me stop share, then I'm not sure what I can do about this.
Share your screen again.
Daphne, you need to expand your presentation into full presentation mode and then share it.
Can you see it now?
Yes, much better.
Oh, sorry about that. Okay, so here you can see the gaps between men and women in different age groups. Yeah? And what is clear from this slide are 3 points. There is convergence over time in participation rates. The gap in the participation rate of women and men is around 10 percentage points for younger individuals and around double that for individuals of higher age groups. A point that doesn't emerge from the slide is that the wider gap for the prime age individuals is partly a cohort effect. So things have been changing over time. And the third point to emerge is that the participation rate of young men and women shows a slight decline in the aftermath of the sovereign debt crisis. Now, significant differences exist in the employment rates of women and men in Greece and the employment rates of women and men in Greece and advanced OECD countries. Now, the points that emerge from this slide are not different to those that emerged from the previous slide. One feature, however, which is more visible here, is that during the sovereign debt crisis, the slowdown in employment for men was higher than the slowdown in employment for women, leading to some convergence in employment rates. Now, turning to focus on 20 to 34-year-olds, and the reason for which I didn't start for the focus on 15 to 34 years old is because I think there is too much heterogeneity, which is not important, and it obscures the other facts. So what we can see here is, I think, 2 basic points emerge. These are percentages of individuals by type of activity or inactivity in the population. Yeah. So 2 basic facts, I think, stand out. The first is the much lower percentage of unemployed young men compared to unemployed young women. And the second, the much lower percentage of inactive and not in education young men compared to inactive and not in education young women, the red line. So one obvious question, to me at least at this point, is what do these young women who are not in education and not in the labor market, what are they doing? And an implicit way to find out what they're doing is to ask the reasons for which they are not participating in the labor market. The labor force data suggests that around 40% of individuals in the age group 20 to 24, which goes up to around 65% or higher in the group between 25 and 29 and the group between 30 and 34, are not participating in the labor market because they are taking care of children or dependents or for other family or personal reasons. Now, this is despite the fact, so we have a high percentage of women who are not participating in the labor market, despite the fact that young women are very educated. In fact, they are more educated than young men. So how much human capital goes unused? And this, I think, is a very important question. If we look, this slide presents the percentage of individuals by a highest education attainment level according to whether they are active or whether they are inactive. And what we can see, the ellipses that have been singled out, is that we have a very high percentage of, or rather a higher percentage of young women who are university graduates and are active. And we have a higher percentage of women than men who are university graduates and are inactive. Another way to look at this information, and perhaps more clear, is to look at the labor force participation by education level for men and women. And we can see that a higher education graduate, men have a higher participation rate than women who are higher education graduates. Okay, now this is a point that was touched upon by Dimitris. Where do young women work? And we can see that they are mainly working in sectors that demand a low level of skills. Here I've singled out the 5 sectors in which most women work. And we can see that, for example, there are about the same percentage of men and women working in the first 2 sectors, but then you have a higher percentage of women working in human health and social work activities and education, and a higher percentage of women working in professional, scientific, and technical activities. What is also interesting, I think, to look at is whether this changes when people become older. And we can see that the high percentage of individuals employed in wholesale and retail trade falls somewhat when people get older, and falls a lot when people, for individuals in the accommodation and food service activities. Okay. And now, how are people remunerated? Are men and women remunerated? And this figure here refers to the whole of the employed labor force, or rather, it refers to the employed individuals in firms employing over 10 employees, but it doesn't refer only to the young. And what we can see from the graph, which shows the unconditional wage comparison, is that in the private sector, there is around a 10 percentage wage gap in 2014. And if we take the whole economy into account, the wage gap is lower. And this is because the public sector pays equal wages to men and women. Now, if we do some estimations of conditional wage comparisons, so taking into account the education of individuals, the sectors they're working in, and other demographic and productive characteristics, we find that the conditional gender gap in 2010 and 2014 is of the order of 7%. It is slightly wider in 2018. We also find out that the age profile of wage rates is steeper for men than for women. And an additional year of tenure, or despite this fact, an additional year of tenure is associated with a higher rate of return for women than it is for men. We also find that the rates of return to education are higher for men than they are for women.
Daphne, can I interrupt? Could you please explain the graph on the left, the previous slide? So this is what is it exactly? Female wages of female workers as a ratio of male workers?
Exactly. It's the ratio of women's wages over men's wages.
So it's 1 minus the gender wage gap. All right. Thank you.
So women's wages are, if you look at the red line or the red dotted line, are 98% of men's wages.
Exactly. All right. Thank you.
Okay. So what about the pandemic experience? Dimitris mentioned that the pandemic has not affected the labor market in a massive way. And so we cannot see any huge increase in the unemployment rate. In fact, we can see a decrease in the unemployment rate because of a continuing trend. This is somewhat due to the measures that were taken to prevent dismissals of workers. But it's also due to the fact that there is an increasing sort of momentum in the Greek labor market so far as 2021 is concerned. But one fact that stands out is that we know that a lot of individuals were temporarily out of work during the pandemic. We also know that there was a large decrease in the hours worked. And we also know that there was an increase in those inactive in the labor market. Some of the occupations that were mostly affected by the pandemic are occupations in which a high share of women are employed. And this is what is visible in the first column here. So these are occupations in which the increase in temporarily out of work workers was high. And you can see that the share of women employed in these is quite high. Now, these are mostly sectors in which education requirements are not that high, as you can see from the fact that there is a high share of individuals with only a high school leaving certificate. And what I think is quite interesting is the last column, which shows that these are occupations which are relatively low paid. So this is their pay compared to the pay in the whole of the economy. Okay, now going to sort of wrapping up. If you'd like to interpret the evidence or talk about demand and supply side barriers to women's representation at the workplace, I would single out the following. I would say from the demand side, which in my view is the most important element in explaining the limited employment of women in the Greek labor market, the small size of Greek firms prevents employers from hiring individuals they fear will be absent. There are gender stereotypes, as can be seen by the criteria employers reply they use to select amongst candidates. And there are very few women that are promoted in high-level positions. From the supply side, there are still stereotypes in the Greek society that don't ask from women to participate in the labor market. There are insufficient childcare facilities, and there is low career progression, which reduces the average returns to education for women. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Daphne. Now we have completed the main presentations. I have allowed the speakers a bit more time to present the work, and now we can move to the discussions. We'll start with Eirini Andriopoulou in alphabetical order, who's actually, she is a former student of ours at the Athens University of Economics and Business. Now she holds an important post at the government's Council of Economic Advisors, and she works on the macroeconomy and microsimulation, which sound like two diametrically opposed things, and she will discuss the report that Daphne and Dimitris and Hege and Ragnhild presented, drawing on her own experience. Eirini, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I would like first also to thank the research team for the invitation to discuss the useful findings of the research project. The timing of the publication indeed couldn't be more appropriate, as the European Commission has announced just before releasing the autumn package that 2022 is the European Year for Youth. Also, as mentioned in the report, there are various documents in the last years from the Greek governments which increasingly acknowledge the importance of the integration of young people and women in the labor market as a prerequisite for harvesting the full potential of the Greek economy. So some examples are the national reform programs, the national growth strategies, the Pisaridis report, the national recovery and resilience plan. The great advantage of the current survey is that it first illustrates all aspects of underutilization of the labor potential of young and women in the Greek labor market, and justifies why this constitutes a major disadvantage for the development of the Greek economy. At the same time, It offers valuable policy-making suggestions, drawing also from the experience of Nordic countries. Thus, the policymakers, I think, should exploit the option of coupling the implementation of RRP projects and reforms with policy recommendations included in the current report. In addition, the report could be linked with at least 3 of the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, the progress on which Greece needs to monitor in the forthcoming years. In particular, the SDG 8, decent work and economic growth, SDG 5, gender equality, and SDG 4, quality of education, are directly linked with the report. What I really liked in all chapters is that they present what we observe from the aggregate statistics and macro level, and then deep in detail into the micro level, individual decisions, labor participation, decisions of firms regarding employment, investment, and innovation. To this end, the analysis of the Nordic experience is very useful, as it highlights that the social welfare state of these countries that we all admire is based on the full employment strategy. This means that in these countries, first, the policy making serves for years this target. Second, that all policies are consistent to this target. And third, that the authorities avoid adopting contradictory policies or policies that may distort the labor market incentives and confuse the decisions of households and individuals. So promoting gender equality, supporting young people's labor market entry right after the completion of their studies, removing the burden of maternity, paternity from employers and distributing it equally between the two sexes are just some examples of policies that at the end serve in the Nordic countries the goal of high employment rates. In policy terms, this means that if we want and we are willing to have a transition towards this direction, we should commit to a specific target, and that all policies which may distort this target should be removed. This certainly comes with a political cost. There will be clearly winners and losers from the reforms. And another important element is that the priorities should have a continuity across governments and should be well monitored within the budgetary cycle. The development of performance budgeting that sets horizontal targets across ministries, which are monitored through specific indicators, is a policy tool that could, in my opinion, serve this purpose. Moreover, performance budgeting can lead to the development of age cost profiles for different policies like health, education, social protection, through which we would be able to some extent to see how the spending is distributed across different ages. And in this way, a fairer intergenerational use of public money could be secured. Talking about intergenerational fairness, I would like further to bring your attention to an issue that it was not stressed so much in the report, and that is the effect that a decreased participation of youth and females may have on long-term sustainability of public finances through the estimation of the aging cost. The methodology used for the projections by the Aging Working Group of the Commission includes an underlying assumption for the labor force participation, which is it's quite substantial. I was looking at the figures, and for the total population, it is assumed that participation rates will increase by 3.5 percentage points between 2019 and 2030, and by 8.4 at the end of the projection, which is 2070. For females, the rates and the increase are rather higher. So it is important for the long-term sustainability of the pension system that we will be able to reach this target and to fulfill these assumptions. On specific policy recommendations, there are too many included in the report. I will just focus on a few. policies for childcare and long-term care of the elderly are of paramount importance for promoting gender, and the increased spending on these sectors may also help reduce the informality of work or increase wages, as Daphne highlighted. And it's important because they are predominantly provided by women, the labor in these sectors. In parallel goes the proper functioning of the educational system, so that parents feel that children are in a schooling program that works full-time with high quality and they are safe and secure. Gender equality should be embedded early in the educational process in order to eliminate the stereotypes which are deeply rooted in patriarchal perceptions and norms, as the report mentions. I really had much difficulty this year to justify to my daughter why she couldn't wear jeans and sneakers at the national parade, while the boys of her class could, and she had to wear a skirt that she hates and ballerina shoes. Yet this distinction of the educational system is not worse than the discrimination that our official tax system does, classifying always the male as the main taxpayer in the tax return, irrespective of the woman's income. These are just some everyday examples. So I think that the report brings up that tackling the problem also of low life satisfaction that may occur through wrong professional choices is not an individual issue, but a societal. This is something very important. And if the youth believe that the balance between working life and family is impossible, and the economy cannot secure high quality and well-paid jobs, the demographic trends will worsen with further consequences. So early intervention from school and providing professional orientation as talents and skill diagnosis is important. There are also other policies described in the report. I will leave it for the other speakers to comment. Just to conclude, I would wish to highlight the value of representation of young people and of the development of grassroots decision and policy making, which involves the youth, which should be treated on equal terms and in a mutual, let's say, exchange of views and interaction with older cohorts. Also, older cohorts could draw inspiration from the actions, visions, and also insights of young people. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Eirini. That was very interesting. I will move straight away to the next discussant, who's Stavros Gavroglou from the National Institute of Labour and Human Resources. Stavros is the Director of Active Policies and International Networks. Over to you.
Okay. Thank you very much for the invitation. It is a pleasure and great honor to participate in today's presentation of this report in the company of such distinguished researchers and scholars. The report is particularly welcome as it addresses in a comprehensive way some of the most pressing issues facing the Greek economy and society, namely the underutilization of human capital or the wasting of the productive potential of young people and especially women. Its main strengths are, I think, one, the breadth of its statistical exposition of the state of the Greek labor market and related trends. Two, the thorough and up-to-date overview of the educational system and the vet system. Three, the policy responses of the pandemic to the pandemic. And four, the well-designed survey on the views of young men and women on their labor market integration and the barriers they face. Especially refreshing and thought-provoking is the juxtaposition of the Nordic experience, which injects realism to the utopian motto, "A better world is possible." I have 4 points to think about. One, there are suggestions on the report about the possibly adverse effects of the minimum wage on employment, in line with the neoclassical theory on the matter, and citing the influential work of Newmark and Washer. I would have preferred, to be honest, a more balanced approach, especially in light of this year's Nobel Prize in economics given to David Card, who along with Alan Kruger cast more than a doubt on the orthodox view that a minimum wage is a counterproductive measure that harms the employment of those it intends to help. In discussing the high level of skills mismatch and overqualification, the report cites, among others, the unfortunate choices made by the Greek youth with respect to their field of study and choice of economic sector that result in underutilization of their qualifications, in disappointment, and in discouragement. While the report is right on to point out that a better support system, including career counseling and updating of curricula, would indeed be of help, and while the authors are correct in pointing out that part of the blame for the skill shortages for which employers often complain should be attributed to them due to the low wages and working conditions they offer, I believe that the problem is not so much the concentration of youth and female employment on less knowledge-intensive sectors, such as retail, trade. Rather, I think it is the low road taken by many employers in these sectors in Greece. Possibly, it is not just the sectoral composition of the Greek economy, but the particular occupational composition of these sectors shaped by Greek businesses that is to blame for the underutilization of the increasingly highly qualified youth, and especially young women. A comparison of Greece with other countries in a project actually I conducted with my good colleague Vasilis Kotsios shows that there are major differences between Greece and other countries, especially Nordic ones, in the share of high-skilled jobs within each sector. So, for example, in the retail and wholesale trade sectors, in Greece, the percentage of high-skilled jobs in the sector is just 13%. In Sweden, the corresponding share is 41%. In Denmark, 31%, and in Norway, 34%. So you have a retail sector that is highly skilled or a retail sector that is low skilled. Another point, reforming the educational and the vet system to be more responsive to labor market needs is certainly a good goal, as long as it does not amount to actually catering to the needs of short-term, low value-added orientation of many Greek businesses. That would only perpetuate the position of the Greek economy and society at the bottom layers of the international division of labor. Incidentally, in response to a good recommendation made in the report about better coordination between the ministries of education and labor, I'm happy to announce that there's a historic cooperation that is underway between the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Labor and the National Institute of Labor and the mechanism of labor market diagnosis that I'm working at for an integrated system tracking the paths, the educational and career paths of all levels of graduates from each level of education into the labor market with the cooperation of IEP, Institute of Educational Policy, ELPEP, and so on. Lastly, I think that the lucid exposition of the Nordic experience in the report shows that integrating young people into the labor market is not problem-free, and that a conditional provision of benefits that recently has been advancing may be advisable indeed. Above all, however, it shows the interlinkages between and the path dependency of many policy pillars. At the heart of the Scandinavian model seems to lie a commitment to full employment, which seems to fuel a continuous push for the further integration of the youth and of women in the labor market, and an unrelenting combat against socially corrosive and economically counterproductive age and sex discrimination, which in turn maximizes the funding and social acceptance of a generous welfare state, which in turn allows for the efficient allocation and reallocation of labor while maintaining social security and cohesion. The report shows that it is possible to escape the vicious cycle experienced in particular by the Greek youth and young women. It can be achieved not by importing piecemeal individual policies from Scandinavia, but by adopting an alternative, cohesive set of policies that put into motion a virtuous cycle of inclusion, solidarity, and productivity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stavros. And now we'll move to the next discussant, Vasilis Monastiriotis. Vasilis is Associate Professor at the London School of Economics, and he has published a lot on labor market issues in economics and policy. Vasilis.
Thank you. Mano, you can hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Perfect.
Okay, lovely. Well, let me start by thanking the organizers for the invitation, and just to say it's lovely to be among some of the very good colleagues that I know for so long, but I haven't seen for a long while. I had prepared a few things to say. Many of the things I wanted to say were actually covered by Mr. Gavroglou, and I fully agree with the thing, especially the thing he said at the very last point, that about importing piecemeal policies rather than thinking about models. So let me go to some of the things I prepared to say about the study. So the study addresses a very, very big number of issues, a huge topic. It is framed on youth and gender, but all the themes that come up in across the many pages of the study about overeducation, overqualification, labor market exclusion, the low participation of females in the job market and of youth, issues of discrimination, skill formation, and of course the mismatch. So very many issues, and very important also because they link to the growth model, as we have been discussing. But also I think Eirini mentioned, also the fiscal dimension, the viability of pension systems if we cannot get young people into employment. Who's going to pay, so to speak, for our pensions if the next generation do not have jobs to pay national insurance contributions? So very big things, and of course also the report does very, very well to identify when relevant the underlying issues, if you want, the structural issues about the extensive self-employment in the economy, institutional and non-institutional rigidities, including stereotypes and cultural issues. Of course, the problems of the education system and to what extent it does actually prepare people for the transition into employment, but also things like the very large number of small firms, small employers, informality, undeclared work, and low productivity and others. So the study is not just a study of youth and gender. That's how I would suggest to the audience, if you want to see it. It is a study that takes the issue of youth and gender and does a comprehensive analysis of what is actually happening in the labor market, both coming in on the, if you want, early stage to review the picture before the crisis, but also following trends and patterns in the crisis and into the pandemic. And of course, as the previous discussion said, the link to the lessons from the Nordic experience is very, very valuable. So I very, very strongly congratulate everybody involved in the study and recommend it very strongly also to anybody interested in any research or policy work on the Greek labor market, and definitely in relation to youth and female and gender issues. Now, I would like to raise a couple of points on things that we do not actually know, or they do not always they're not always the way they seem. So I want to challenge three main things basically. One is about the importance of youth unemployment. Youth unemployment is twice as high as total unemployment, and it is very, very important for youth to be able to be integrated into the job market as soon as possible. But actually, the ratio of youth to total unemployment has not changed with the crisis, where we saw the eruption of the crisis. There's a secular trend of increasing ratio already from the 90s, but otherwise it is quite constant over the cycle. It is natural, always youth will be more unemployed than less young people. And that's why also in Norway it is the same, and in Germany it is the same. It's just that the numbers are very different. Yeah, so the scale of the problem is different. The other thing I want to raise is what happens with the term need, not in education, employment, training. This is a very good term, and it does actually allow us to think, as we also saw earlier in the presentation, about inactive need versus unemployed need versus the opposite of people in education or in employment. However, sometimes we tend to focus on something which is not a particular problem. It is just a different manifestation of a general problem. So the study reveals that there's in 2019, need rates have fallen and they're around 20%. Well, 20% non-participation is the same also for older people. A 50-year-old has also an 80% probability of being in employment and a 20% probability of being not in education, employment, or training, i.e. of being inactive. So it is not so terrible as it looks, of course, keeping in mind how important it is for a youth to be actually integrated into the labor market. The other thing about youth is that what education does for the youth is not just that they're removing themselves from the labor market, but of course, as we know, it is an investment. It is an investment privately, but also an investment with social returns. So the fact that we have lower employment rates can also be turned around to present it as a fact that we have higher education rates. And the report does very, very well to highlight that, how significant has been the increase of enrollment rates at tertiary education of youth, and how much there is an advantage of females as well. So these are important things. It's not just that we have low labor market outcomes. We have low labor market outcomes sometimes for good reason. The issue of the gender dimension, I think, has been touched also very, very well. Again, something to note, yes, there's a 10-row wage differential of 10%. If you account for characteristics, it becomes 7%, as the study and the chapter by Daphne, and I think the research that Ms. Nicolitsas also reveals. But then if you control for selection and everything, it falls. It falls to maybe 2 or 3 percentage points. So it is not so terrible. What is terrible, I shouldn't say terrible, what is more problematic, I would think, is how society views the role of women, the household division of labor, the role of stereotyping by employers, but also self-stereotyping by females, where they position themselves into different roles in the job market and into the household. I think these are the important cleavages and issues, rather than so much what the employers do on the wage thing. Let me close with the skill issue. Of course, the skill mismatch is the central message of the study, and it talks about the study talks about sort of coordinating the education system. But as Mr. Gavroglou said very, very rightly, one has to think, what is the side of the employers? You know, it's always easy to complain that the education system does not provide the skills that I need in my workplace. But the question should be turned around and say, why do employers not provide the training? Why do we not see the levels of training that we see in other countries? The moment you ask this question, it is not about gender, it is not about youth, it is about systems of skill formation. And I think if I was to criticize, to critique, if you want, one aspect of the study is that it doesn't spend enough of its focus exactly on this, of systems of skill formation. There's obviously the reference to the Nordic model. The Nordic model is part, in general, of this kind of collectivist system, not the liberal, let's say, Anglo-Saxon, not the statist France. It is this collectivist where you have both active involvement of the state or of state actors, but also very active involvement by the firms into training, into skills provision, skills identification, activation, and everything else. Now, the difference is, I think, that the Nordic model pays too much attention to the unemployed through activation policies, active labor market policies. There's another version of the collectivist model, more closer to Germany, the Germanic model, where the attention is more in the education system. So for the employed, and there's more in-work training, as you know, and so forth. Now, when it comes to how do we learn from these experiences, I think the closing words of Mr. Gavroglou encapsulate the main message. You cannot just seek to import policies, but also I would add you cannot import models. You have to adapt, you have to look into your own structure, institutions, in order to develop your own model, because models are embedded into the institutions, but also into the culture of the society. It is very important to understand why employers do not provide training opportunities. One of the survey findings was that many employed youth identify that they have very, very low learning and career opportunities in their jobs. Why employers do not provide the training, why employers do not upgrade in terms of skill content their own jobs, what keeps employers, including through the regulation system, the institutional setting of the economy, what keeps employers into this low-cost price competition type of modus operandi, and not into investing in skills, training the workforce, investing in the workforce. You have to think, do I need more flexibility so that people are mobile? If they are mobile, maybe the employers will not invest in the skills of the workforce. Or maybe that's what I want, I have to focus on generic skills, not on sector or firm-specific skills. These things are things that policy has to think by looking into the country, not necessarily by looking into other examples, other systems, and then try to import, if you want, sexy ideas, but not ideas that would necessarily be embedded and work well into the existing system. So that's all I had to say. The main message, again, this is a very, very important study, and very many congratulations to everybody involved.
Thank you so much, Vasilis. Let us rush straight away to our last discussant, who's Konstantinos Pouliakas, an expert at CEDEFOP, the European Center for the Development of Vocational Training. So he comes straight after Vasilis' points about skills formation systems. Mr. Pouliakas, over to you.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for the kind invitation on behalf of myself and also CEDEFOP, my organization. Allow me also to congratulate from my side on such a wealthy and comprehensive report that has been prepared. And, without reiterating too much the points that were raised by our previous discussants, I also feel that the wealth of information and coverage is so huge that it obviously extends well beyond issues of youth inclusion and gender equality, and it touches upon generally the whole issue on the extent to which the Greek economy and the Greek labor market is managing to make the best use of its human resources and of the links with its educational and training system. In that respect, trying to essentially reinforce some of the points that were made by Mr. Monastiriotis and Mr. Gavroglou. He mentioned that there should be more discussion about skill systems, and I can therefore highlight how, on the basis of the European Skills Index that CEDEFOP has developed, Greece is ranked very low, almost at the bottom among all European member states. And in particular, that ranking is not as low because of issues of skill development, but in particular, Greece ranks very low in the issues of skills activation, which is exactly one of the points that the report raises, the fact that we do a very poor job in terms of activating our, in particular, newly educated human resources and getting them into the labor market. But also Greece is the last in the issue of skills mismatch, with various ways and various facets that this is measured and with many different ways that people tend to comprehend this issue, either in terms of qualification mismatches, skill mismatches, having many educated people working in low-paid jobs. But the reason I mentioned this is because there is also, I felt that the report could emphasize even more this issue, which is, for instance, that we always talk about how Greece has been producing and doing a remarkable job in terms of increasing educational participation rates, and how we now have a very high rate of individuals, especially young individuals, with high tertiary education attainment rates. But at the same time, we do realize, and this is very much marked from the OECD PIAC survey, that Greece is also, in terms of European countries, in terms of developed countries, one of the lowest when we are ranking the overall skill level. of its population. And also, in most countries in the EU, you can also see that there is typically a big wedge between the skill level of young people and the skill level of older people. But in Greece, that wedge is relatively smaller compared to our neighbors. So it is very clear that Greece has done great strides in terms of improving its human capital. But I think the point that was also raised in Mr. Katsikas' presentation, we're producing more graduate, but what type of graduate? It's always a very enduring issue that we need to be discussing. So moving on, I wanted to raise 2 or 3 more points, which complement, in essence, the report. I would highlight that in terms of the impact of the pandemic on the outcomes of young people, of females in the labor market, I would stress very much that the pandemic has also accentuated what I would call the digital skill gap between men and women. And I base this on recent evidence that we have collected as part of CEDEFOP's European Skills and Jobs Survey that we conducted this summer in 2021, which is basically has tried to measure the extent to which EU adult workers have been exposed to new digital technologies. And from our survey, it comes out quite strongly that females report that they have been exposed and subjected to a lesser extent to such new digital software, new digital programs, new computerized machinery in their workplace. So that, I think, is a mechanism which will have perpetuating inequality effects in the future. And in general, we know that the digital gap of females relative to males starts very early on from their field of education choices. But this type of evidence also highlights very clearly that we need to pay attention to the fact that females also enter into jobs which are potentially less technologically intensive compared to males. In terms of the gender wage gap, which is related, I was going to make the point, as Mr. Monastiriotis made, that it seems paradoxical that the gender wage gap in Greece is much lower compared to the EU average. And the way that I rationalize that is by the fact that exactly in Greece you have a much lower participation rate of females, so you have much larger selectivity effects. So I think that is something that policymakers also need to be aware of, and it needs to be stressed, because otherwise, you know, we can quickly dismiss the issue and quickly say that, okay, Greece is doing very well in terms of the gender wage gap, whereas the real fundamental issue has to do with the combination of the participation plus the wage determination issue. In a sense, we need to understand what are the wage offers that are given to females and determining their reservation wages, determining whether or not they are deciding to participate in the Greek labor market, and if not, why not? And I think the reason why they are not participating has been clearly highlighted in the report. In terms of family responsibilities, in terms of differential attitudes to child rearing and childbearing, and therefore a lot of attention needs to be paid from policy in terms of gender equality policies, in terms of support for childcare policies. And I'll make this linkage further with the COVID pandemic once again, because from recent analysis that I've been doing with a colleague, Nikos Giannakopoulos from the University of Patras, we also have detected that it's exactly females with children who were less likely to benefit from remote work arrangements. So during the pandemic, when it was so crucial to ensure that women and men could continue working from home due to social distancing measures, I think that females with children were actually much more penalized compared to their male counterparts. Moving on so that I can conclude for the sake of time. I want to reiterate the point that in terms of the mismatch that young Greek workers are facing, the research that we have carried out at CEDEFOP with the data sources that I mentioned has clearly showed that we can dismiss the argument that many young Greek workers may be entering overqualified jobs because of career prospect opportunities, because they are trying to have a stepping stone into the labor market. I think our evidence clearly shows that typically young workers end up in what we can call bad quality jobs, jobs with very poor career opportunities. And this is also very much linked to the flexibilization of the labor market. At CEDEFOP, we always say that skills is an investment. Therefore, skills requires time. To have time, you need to have some sort of contractual stability. You need to have, breathing space to be able to develop when you enter into a new firm. So when we are giving too much emphasis on temporary contracts, precarious employment conditions, we need to understand that this is a deterrent for the skill accumulation of young people. So in conclusion, I would just like to say that together with all of the very useful policy recommendations that have been given in the report, I think I would highlight 2 or 3, which, at least from the side of our inventory that we have from the EU in terms of best practices, I think we always need to highlight that tackling the skill mismatch problem requires a comprehensive arsenal of policies. We cannot only do this with making our universities better, making our educational system better. Skill mismatch requires a holistic approach, which includes gender equality policies, includes housing policies, includes employment, good active labor market policies, and of course, good educational policies. I want to make a proposal, if I have 1 or 2 more minutes, which is that we also know that a big problem, a plague in Greece, is that many employers use young people as a disposable resource, and they typically do so using EU funds. So for instance, they hire them for a very short period of time, they get some subsidy, typically from ESPA or some EU fund, they keep them for 2 or 3 months, they fire them afterwards. I think we need, the government and the social partners need to have a very serious discussion and try to set the foundations for ensuring that such type of programs are conditional on the skill accumulation of young people, on the fact that when employers hire them, you need to have a skill audit. You need to ensure that they are carefully guided in terms of what are the requirements of their job, how they can develop themselves professionally within their career. And we need to do this also so that we can, in essence, raise the cost to employers. Now, a macroeconomist would say that is a deterrent for hiring them, but I think that the investment approach needs to outweigh the deadweight approach, okay? We need to find ways to ensure that most employers in Greece, just as they do in France, where firms need to justify how they receive funds on the basis on if they have identified what skill needs they have. In Greece, we need to ensure that firms need to justify what learning outcomes they're expecting from new hires, how they're going to invest in their skill development. I think I will leave it at that for the sake of time, and hopefully we can have a discussion further on. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pouliakas. Thank you very much. That was very interesting. We have another quarter of an hour, at least, for a short discussion, but I'd like to give the floor to Daphne Nicolitsas, who needs to leave in about 30 seconds or something, if she has any reflections on the things that she heard, including criticisms or other observations. Daphne, over to you, and apologies for mismanaging the time as always.
Thank you very much. Apologies from my side, but it was impossible to arrange things differently. Now, thanks very much to everyone for their comments. They are very useful and they're very correct, I think. On the gender wage gap, it's definitely true that this is an in-work wage gap, and the measure that we would be interested in is including individuals who are not participating. Now, in terms of, I just want to raise 2 more points. The first is regarding the non-participation of individuals who are older. That was raised by, who raised this now? By Vasilis Monastiriotis. This, I do accept this as a fact, but I don't think we should use it as a justification for what has happened, because due to cohort effects, we would expect that individuals that are today 50 years old and were 20 years old 30 years ago lived in a totally different environment and thus started their career on a different, with a different perspective. And if I may say, Manos asked the question over the chat of what to do with helping small firms improve childcare. And I think this is a very interesting question to which I don't have an answer. I would though say that the solution is not necessarily make all firms bigger, because small firms that do not remain small have add something to the economy, add some dynamism to the economy. But on the other hand, I'm sure there must be some solution of sort of pooling resources for childcare facilities, or using some subsidized replacement when women have to leave their post to take care of their family. I'm sorry to be so rude and have to go, but unfortunately it is impossible for me to stay for longer. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Daphne.
Bye.
Bye-bye. All right, we have another 13 minutes. I have sent Hege and Ragnhild a question on chat, but before I give them the floor, I would like to ask Dimitris to reflect on the points that have been made, and perhaps add one point of my own. So, as you know, in Greece, there has been a debate in recent years about whether the obvious difficulties that are faced by young people in entering the labor market might be attenuated by keeping a sub-minimum wage, in other words, a lower minimum wage for young workers relative to everybody else, as was the case between 2013 and 2019, not before, and it was the sub-minimum wage for youth was abolished a couple of years ago. I could ask Vasilis to say a few words about that too, because he was heavily involved in that too. Well, not necessarily in abolishing a sub-minimum wage, but in help the then government set the new minimum wage. It's a question. I'm not entirely clear myself whether a sub-minimum wage might be a good idea. So if you want to say a few words about that too, but please reflect on the more profound points that were made by others first.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to thank everybody for their comments. I think they were very helpful and very useful and correct. I would agree with most of them, I think. I want to make two major points. I think people said, and they are right, I said it myself at the beginning, that this is a broad and big and ambitious in terms of the coverage it has study. And this is both good and bad. It's good because this was done by design, as I described at the beginning, because the idea was exactly to try and take a picture, if you like, of what's happening in the Greek labor markets, particularly focusing on young people and women, and why they're not, what are the kinds of problems they're facing integrating in the labor market. So in order to have as a comprehensive picture as possible, you need to go broad, to go wide, and cover many topics. And this, unfortunately, unavoidably, of course, leads to less depth in the analysis and the research in particular issues that you tend to that emerge from the research. And the idea, as I said before, is that at the second stage of this research project, we pick up specific issues that did emerge in this first stage as particularly important, and we delve into much more detail through quantitative and qualitative research later on. Therefore, I accept some of them. I accept the criticism and the comments because, yes, so on the skills mismatch issue, for example, obviously a lot more can be said. The skill systems issue that was mentioned by both Vasilis and Konstantinos Pouliakas and Gavroglou as well, I think, are absolutely right. And there's much more to be said there. I really also, I think I really like and agree with the argument. I've read your recent research, Mr. Gavroglou, on the, if you like, skills profile within the sectors, and not so much between sectors. This distinction between sectors that we very often make, and we do make also the study. But it's also very important to look at the skill profile, the skill makeup within the section, because even low value added sectors can have a large part of high skilled jobs, as you mentioned. But all these are issues meant to be addressed in more detail, go deeper into these issues, and very likely would be very happy to actually work with you and exchange views with you later on, so to be able to continue this project at the second stage. And the second major, if you like, issue I would like to note is that was mentioned pretty much by everybody, is this a useful comparison. I thought as well it was very useful to have this comparison with Nordic countries, what's happening over there. There are very successful examples of policies being able to successfully integrate young women in the labor market. But I teach a class in comparative political economics. I totally agree with the idea that you cannot import either models or, perhaps you can import policies. I'm not disagreeing with the point of Mr. Gavroglou that you don't want to make piecemeal imports of policy measures, but I think some ad hoc policy measures can be imported more easily than entire models. I think the idea here would be to draw inspiration from the approach, not necessarily do the same things as the Nordic countries, but draw inspiration that we need to have a comprehensive model to begin with, suited, adjusted to the Greek needs, to the Greek culture, to the Greek history and features of the Greek economy, obviously, but have a model first of all, because we do not have a model to begin with a guiding principle, with a set of clear priorities and so on. So then you can build on that and then start borrowing from successful models like those in Scandinavia and kind of adjust them. I mean, this is the issue of, in comparative political economy, we call institutional complementarities. You also, all of you mentioned that institutions and policies need to link to each other. Path dependency was mentioned. Obviously, in Greece, exactly because we don't have a model built from scratch in a coherent way, we have contradictory policies, we have policies undermining each other. There's no, as Konstantinos Pouliakas said, no holistic approach, for example, in the skills issue or in any other issue, I would probably say. And I think this is what, in effect, undermines even good initiatives like reforms that have been promoted in recent years. And this is what we try also to say in the study. Regarding the last question of Manos Matsaganis, which also links, I think, to somewhat a criticism by Mr. Gavroglou. I didn't write the chapter, but I think that the idea was not so much I don't think the idea was to criticize minimum wage as an idea, as a policy. I don't think anybody would agree with that in our team. But so much as perhaps I think the author meant was referring mostly to the sub-minimum wage for very young people with low skills or educational qualifications, not graduated yet, and so on and so forth, which links to what Manos asked. I'm not certain, to be honest, that's the answer. Perhaps Vasilis can enlighten us more, because I have not done research into this particular issue. So I know that research that has been done shows that the sub-minimum wage did not have any substantial impact in increasing employment. Some studies find a positive one, but not very substantial. Others not find any impact at all. So, and I think the pandemic kind of confused things even more, because We don't have a large number of years. I mean, we were still in the latter part of the previous decade, still the economy was recovering from the huge crisis. So anyway, I think the data is going to be a bit problematic to draw a definite conclusion, but in any case, now we're in a different situation. And I would love to hear what Vasilis' views on that.
Okay, time is running short, so I will give the floor to Vasilis, provided he can give me a yes or no answer to whether a sub-minimum wage for youth is a good idea.
Drum roll, maybe. No, I think we have enough evidence to show that the sub-minimum wage, especially places like this, basically just do a substitution between younger and older people. We identified already in the discussion the problem that employers perhaps too much go for the cost containment, the low cost option instead of the high road. I think we're fine. We can go keep the wages where they are, have not have a sub-minimum wage for the youth, and let the employers do the work, do the investment and upgrade the skills and the productivity of the workforce. We don't have any evidence to say that the sub-minimum has done a damage, so that the not having a sub-minimum, it creates a damage to the youth.
All right, thank you, Vasilis. I would like to close by giving the floor to our guests from Norway, Hege and Ragnhild. I've sent them on chat a brief question. Obviously, they can also reflect on the other points raised during the presentations and by the discussants. My question is that although it is very difficult to transfer solutions from one country to the other, given that country experiences are so deeply embedded in history and in policy traditions, which features of the Norwegian labor market, in their view, might hold the most useful lessons for Greece? So, Hege and Ragnhild, over to you.
Would you mind if I start, Ragnhild? Okay, thank you. This has been actually a very, very interesting seminar. I was a bit skeptical at the beginning to compare Greece and Norway, but I have learned so lot. So this has been extremely useful from my side of view. Just a short comment. I think it was mentioned that Norway or the Scandinavian countries seems to have an over-obsession with the unemployed, and I must say I agree with that, but that was not what we are going to discuss here. I would like to actually reflect on the question asked, because everyone has said correctly that it is very difficult to escape from your own path dependency and to adopt just bits and bobs of a model. But if I were to just highlight one singular point, I would say that the issue of gender equality is going to be the answer. And the reason why I say that is because it undermines the whole society, because, of course, young people also has a gender, but that's not my point. My point is that if you look at the history of Norway, we didn't have oil. We came out after the Second World War also as a rather poor country with rather bleak prospects. So to think that if you feel like you're in a situation that can't be changed, you can definitely look at the history of Norway, how things really have changed. And people are very obsessed about the oil revenue of Norway. I know it's really large, but if you look at the value of women's contribution to the Norwegian labor market, it exceeds our oil revenue, which means that Greece holds the same prospect. If they include their own women into the labor market, it will be as valuable as the oil of Norway. So if you just look at it from a purely economic perspective, it is believable to me that you would like to keep your daughters, wives, mothers at home. I don't understand it. And also, I would say that it is very important, if you're going to achieve gender equality, that you look at the role of men, at the role of fathers, grandfathers in society. Because the way you view women, talk about women, girls, daughters, will decide whether you're going to succeed or not succeed. It was very interesting, and a shame that Daphne left, because I think that her last remark was that something about childcare and something small businesses in case the mother had to go home to care for a child. I mean, in order to achieve gender equality, there is no gender in that sentence. It means the parent has to go home. It has to be just as self-evident that the father has to leave his work if a child is sick than the mother. And unless you change that, you will not succeed. I'm pretty sure of that. And I think that there is a lot of talk of policies, but this is also about the attitude, how you actually view your own population, how you talk about. And I think the initiator, what makes the ball roll, what actually initiate change, is that if you start to take it as a self-evidence, then that a highly educated woman is not going to stay home to take care of family members. Unless that is not kind of integrated into the discussion, change is not going to happen, I think. Of course, I'm not ignoring any of the other remarks that are extremely important. And I totally agree. But if I'm going to just pick out one point, it has to be gender equality.
Thank you, Hege. Can I ask Ragnhild if she would care to say a few words reflecting on the points that have been made by others?
No, I will not do that. I think Hege wrapped this very nicely up, and I think this has been a very interesting afternoon. And thank you to everybody for sharing and commenting. And thank you very much.
Well, in that case, thank you very much. And thank you all the speakers and the discussants and the ambassador for, I think, extremely interesting discussion. Let's do it again. But now it's getting late. So let me say goodbye to everybody and thank you very much. I look forward to seeing you again on another occasion. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Okay.
Great.
Thank you. Bye.